Hello and welcome back to the GSMC Sports Podcast brought to you by the GSMC Sports Network. I'm your host, TJ Mabardi. Today is Thursday, February 15th, and today we are going to be talking a lot of NFL. We are going to be starting with the Chiefs Super Bowl parade, of course, the tragedy that happened yesterday, so briefly touching on that while also sort of highlighting some of the positives that did come out of the day there. Then we are going to be talking about the San Francisco 49ers decision to fire their defensive coordinator, Steve Wilks, just a few days after the Super Bowl loss. This was a little bit of a controversial move here, so we'll be touching on that before moving on to some Justin Fields destination, some potential landing spots for him, and just sort of evaluating how the fit and how I personally would like seeing Fields in these different destinations before finally wrapping up the show by just recapping last night's NBA games as we are just about at the All-Star break. So we will be getting into all of that. But before we do so, just a reminder to like and follow wherever you may be listening to us. And just a reminder for our live viewers to consider using the link at the bottom ticker that is scrolling across throughout the stream. That is streamelements.com/gsmcsportsnetwork./tip to help get your questions the priority they deserve. Without further ado, getting into our first segment here and the Chiefs Super Bowl parade. Now, it is very unfortunate how this obviously all played out, because in a day that was supposed to be for the celebration of this incredible run that the Chiefs have been on the past few years, it unfortunately was stained with tragedy, where there was a shooting that took place towards the end of the parade. There were 23 victims, one person lost their life, and many of the injured were children. So the police detained 3 different people, and it's really scary, honestly. I mean, it's also interesting to put in perspective that during the Denver Nuggets championship parade last summer, after they won the NBA Finals, there was also a shooting that took place where a couple were injured following that parade as well. So not really much of an opinion to give here other than that this is extremely sad, and thoughts and prayers to anyone that was affected by this, and just for everyone to stay safe, because it's really messed up what went on yesterday, and it's the unfortunate reality of sort of how dangerous the world is today. So, with that being said, there's not really a great transition to make to sort of try and then talk about some of the positives and the celebrations that came prior to this tragedy, but we are going to try to as well as possible. The day started at least as a celebration. The vibes were high coming off of the repeat champion Kansas City Chiefs, something that hadn't been done in 19 years. And so it's not something that these Chiefs fans have been unused to celebrating. But I mean, really from a historical standpoint, obviously a hint of real significance with the repeat and all of that. So naturally you have some of these players, specifically Patrick Mahomes and a very drunk Chris Jones, calling for that third championship as well. So, it was a very fun start to the day. There were videos of fans safely, I will note, climbing up light poles and drinking beers, and you had linebacker Willie Gay running down the streets shirtless. Kansas City Chiefs legend Jamal Charles, he came to celebrate the festivities with them. There was not any Taylor Swift sighting, if anybody was curious, but they did, like I just alluded to, have a very drunk Chris Jones who got on the microphone to repeatedly announce that he wants to stay in Kansas City. He said, "I ain't going nowhere, baby. I will be here next year, the year after, and the year after." And he talked about how he wants that third championship. And this is all coming prior to Chris Jones, of course, the superstar interior lineman for the Chiefs. He is an upcoming free agent this offseason. After these clips of him talking about him not going anywhere started circulating, his agent, Michael J. Katz, actually went on Twitter and tweeted out, "Cut them off, bartenders, too much," and then he had a beer emoji. So pretty funny stuff. I mean, it's always, under appropriate circumstances, really funny to see grown men like this just drinking and having a fun time and, sort of acting a little bit childish in a safe manner, of course. But I thought that, it was really funny. I don't know which player it was specifically, but someone was running around shirtless with a bear head on top of them, like a mascot thing. It was quite strange, but again, it was all in good celebration and good fun. So this was actually interesting, though, the Chris Jones situation here, because yes, maybe not the best business tactic, really, to get drunk and sort of announce that you want to essentially stay there no matter what, especially given the fact with the season that Chris Jones had. I mean, 10.5 sacks from an interior defensive lineman position is very much impressive. And, he was great all year. It's not just the sacks. I know that we've sort of referenced on this show before how sacks are a little bit of an overrated stat sometimes. But, I mean, stats all across the board. Chris Jones had a phenomenal season, and it's why he was selected to his second consecutive first-team All-Pro. And, there's no denying how great he is. Where the debate starts to come in is how much money should he be making going forward, because he is maybe on a class of his own now at this point as far as interior linemen. We've seen an older Aaron Donald over the past couple years, but Chris Jones has had, maybe not Defensive Player of the Year impact like that, but pretty close to what Aaron Donald was able to put out all those years when he signed his record-breaking contract a few years ago. So that's sort of what I wanted to reference here to put things into perspective. Aaron Donald was contemplating retirement after the Rams won the Super Bowl in 2021. So then they sort of coaxed him out of that retirement by giving him a big old contract that was worth an annual salary of $31.6 million over the course of a few years. So they rolled out the Brinks truck. This was, at the time, the largest contract in NFL history to a non-quarterback. And I would honestly imagine that we would see sort of a similar contract unfolding here for Chris Jones after the year he just had. And it should be worth noting that, obviously Aaron Donald, one of the greatest ever at his position, but Chris Jones is definitely, on his way to potentially being a Hall of Fame player now. And he is 29. Aaron Donald was 31 at the time that he was given this record-breaking contract. So Chris Jones is actually 2 years younger than Aaron Donald was, I should say, when he got that money. So, we're probably also, that being said, getting into a point here where Chris Jones it's really this year, I think, to make the big-time Brinks Trucks money. This is sort of his last opportunity to do so. And I think that another interesting wrinkle in this whole thing is the fact that, the Chiefs can technically franchise tag him to sort of keep him out of free agency and work things out in-house. But I don't know if that is the best possible solution for them. Now, they have some room to work with in terms of salary cap, but a franchise tag for Chris Jones would cost them over $32 million for the upcoming season based off of his contract that he was receiving prior. Franchise tag is 120% of last year's salary. So this would be an incredibly expensive sort of temporary solution here without working out a long-term deal. And, it's going to be really interesting. I think maybe they try and figure out some way to defer money to the later years where you are going to have Travis Kelce off the books possibly in a couple years. But, the Chiefs do have a good few things they need to address in the coming offseason in terms of expiring contracts. You have Chris Jones, who we've been talking about here, but their number one cornerback, L'Jarius Sneed, he will also be a free agent. He's been a massive pickup for them over the past couple years after drafting him, I believe it was in 2020. Willie Gay and Drew Tranquill, two of their linebackers, two of their key pieces on their defense as well. I think it's worth noting, interestingly, I would actually have to look up the Chiefs tackling leaders this season, but, sort of reminiscent of the Eagles lost both of their top two tacklers the year prior to this year, which was sort of, in my opinion at least, part of their downfall going into this season, not having those two guys at the premier linebacker positions for them. So it is definitely going to be interesting to see how they play this out, because it is Willie Gay, it's Drew Tranquill, also Mike Dana and Tershawn Wharton as well, maybe not quite as prominent as far as their players to really focus on defensively, but other pieces as well. Drew Tranquill, as I looked this up, he was the third leading tackler for the Chiefs behind Justin Reed and Trent McDuffie, interestingly enough. And I don't know, maybe it was just that Willie Gay played a bigger role in the postseason. He was being asked to do more of the QB spy roles in the postseason, and it was definitely a loss for them. You saw the absence of him when the Chiefs played the Buffalo Bills, where they lose him early in that game, and Josh Allen was able to run free a lot in that game. So, maybe it's not quite to the extent of the Eagles situation from the other year, but I always do sort of pay attention to those instances where you are potentially losing, because that's what makes repeating in the Super Bowl so difficult, is you just played on the highest stage. Willie Gay maybe didn't have all those regular season tackles, but it was put on a massive stage how important he was for this Chiefs defense in the postseason. Those are the types of guys that tend to get a little bit of extra money on their contract offers come the offseason. So that'll be really interesting to see. And yeah, I don't know. I mean, they have a lot of things to work out. And Chris Jones, obviously, he wants to be there. And the Chiefs fans love him. The Chiefs GM was talking about how much of an integral part of their franchise and their defense and their team's personality as a whole Chris Jones has been over the past few years. So it is definitely it's definitely going to be a priority of sense to try and work this out with Chris Jones, but I sort of have a little bit of doubts in terms of what sort of cap flexibility they're going to have. Again, not that they're at a total lack of cap room come this offseason, but they have things that they need to address, and Chris Jones is maybe on pace to have a reset sort of the value and have another record-breaking contract off of the books. Nick Bosa sort of had that contract last year for the 49ers when he got his extension. We will see how this sort of plays out with Chris Jones, because, winning on that level especially is something that I will never even be able to remotely understand how it feels. So, it can't be understated, the desire to win. But again, when you are such a premier guy, I was looking earlier at Fox Sports' top free agents for the upcoming season to see where Chris Jones stacked up in terms of these other names. It was Chris Jones at number one. So, there are going to be plenty of teams calling Mr. K, I believe his name is, Mr. Katz, sorry. Plenty of teams calling Mr. Katz, trying to figure out what kind of a contract they could work out with Chris Jones. And, it's interesting again because Kelsey is going to be off the books, at least for the cap hit that he currently holds in the next couple seasons. You still have Mahomes eating up just about 25% of your cap space as a whole. So that's where it gets a little bit difficult, I think, for a team that is trying to consistently be winning Super Bowls to go and dish out over $30 million, let alone $32+ million to a defensive tackle. And again, it's not at all understating the importance and the skill of Chris Jones, the player, but, just a little bit at least of positional value. You have to weigh how you want to play this out. Maybe they just try and skate by with McDuffie. They let L'Jarius Sneed slide. I'm not sure yet. We will have more answers as time comes. But on that note, we are going to be taking our first break. And when we come back on the other side, we are going to be reporting on some very interesting news that came out of the 49ers organization yesterday. So stick with us. We will be right back.
I feel like I'm losing my mind. Is everybody in the world blind? Please, Lord, give me a sign, a sign. I feel like I'm losing my mind. Is everybody in the world blind? Please, Lord, give me a sign, a sign. I wanna be the greatest. Everybody on the fake shit. I look around and feel like everybody is the fakest. I make this every day and I'm impatient, hoping one day I blow up from the basement. Statement, the top is so vacant. I don't hear shit that I think is amazing. Waiting for my day when I'm playing sold out shows for 1,000 faces. Hey, give me that crown, get in my way and to be put down. It ain't your place, all this my town. If I want that shit, then I'll get it right now. I'm losing it, the noose it fits, some losing shit, a stupid myth. You choose to live or choose to dip, you choose to fight or lose your grip and lose a gift. Oh, I feel like I'm losing my mind. Is everybody in the world blind? Please, Lord, give me a sign, a sign. I feel like I'm losing my mind. Is everybody in the world blind?
Welcome back to the GSMC Sports Podcast, brought to you by the GSMC Sports Network. Just wrapped up talking some Chiefs Super Bowl parade talk and sort of the storylines that came out of that as far as Chris Jones wanting to stay and the financial implications really that sort of come with that. And, we will, like I mentioned, continue to be monitoring that. But moving on to our next segment here, talking about the 49ers, who yesterday announced that they would not be bringing back their defensive coordinator, Steve Wilks, Shanahan was on a conference call with reporters and said that they were going to be parting ways with him. Wilks was with the 49ers for just one season, and this was a little bit of a controversial move. Obviously, anytime a team loses in the Super Bowl, their decision making following that is going to be a little bit under a microscope, but I did think that this was a very interesting and not in a great way move. Now, maybe it sounds like from what Shanahan was talking about, it was based off of the fit with Steve Wilks, and that could mean a couple different things. It could mean some more personality. I know that the schemes, there was a difference in between what Shanahan was comfortable with typically with DeMeco Ryans, and I think that Robert Saleh, when he was the defensive coordinator of the 49ers as well, sort of ran a similar scheme, and Wilks didn't perfectly fit into that same style of play, but pretty interesting. I mean, Wilks and this 49ers defense had a pretty good season where in terms of rankings, maybe they dropped from last season to this year, where the Niners were first in 2022 with DeMeco Ryans. That is, they were first in scoring and yards on defense. They were second in takeaways under DeMeco Ryans. Then this year, it's interesting because they dipped in terms of the rankings, like I mentioned, but not a tremendous amount. Across the board, they were third in scoring, eighth in yards allowed, fifth in takeaways. So still top 10 in all of these different categories. It gets interesting if you look at the actual numbers from those past couple seasons with DeMeco Ryans to this year. Despite the rankings being worse under Wilks, all of these statistics were actually better, which I'll lay them out and then I guess sort of give my interpretation of it, where points per game went from 18.9 under DeMeco Ryans to 17.5, that is points allowed. Yards per game allowed went down just slightly, but from 305 to 304. And then takeaways were actually up from 1.5 to 1.7. So again, a little bit of marginal numbers there, but technically, statistically better. Also worse in rankings, and you also look across the league where offense was down this year. So everything's relative. One way or another, though, it means that the defense under Steve Wilks was at least on par with the defense under DeMeco Ryans. And I also think that Wilks dealt with, a little bit of adversity through the year as well. They bring in Javon Hargrave this offseason, who had a big season for them. They trade for Chase Young and add him as a piece as well. But I've talked about it plenty of times, maybe a little bit too much on this show. Talanoa Hufanga isn't necessarily recognized as, that top tier safety in the league, but I think he's very much in that vicinity. I think that he is a real game changer for that 49ers defense on the back end. And surrounding him, there is a lot of youth in that secondary, which is just sort of interesting because of the schemes and the way that they're able to play these games. It seemed like they were trying to sort of, you look at the trade deadline, instead of going out to add some secondary, which I know there wasn't a ton of secondary help necessarily across the league. The Eagles traded for Kevin Byard, and sort of, Byard's a good player. His best years are behind him, though, and you didn't really hear much of him on Philadelphia. You had Rasul Douglas, the Bills trading for him from the Packers, but all in all, it's not like there was a tremendous amount of help out there at the secondary position. But what they did see was an advantage, or an opportunity, I should say, to capitalize on what they thought was the strength of their defense, which was the pass rush and the front seven, where they go and they bring in Chase Young. And, Chase Young, not spectacular this season, but, he was good in the Super Bowl, he got to Mahomes for one of those sacks, and the 49ers were putting pressure on Mahomes for a lot of that game, which is sort of takes me into this next conversation here of how did the defense hold up in the playoffs. Now, again, a couple different ways you can look at this, because they were very solid in the Super Bowl against Mahomes and the Chiefs. There's really not all too much you can do against Mahomes. I mean, just ridiculous stuff that he is doing right now, especially in terms of end of game drives. I saw some stat, and this isn't exact because I'm just recalling it off the top of my head, but Mahomes is something like 7-4-7, I should say, on drives in which his team is trailing in the Super Bowl, or there's like some sort of fourth quarter clutch time stat. Again, I'm very unprepared right now. Maybe shouldn't have even brought it up. But just time and time again, we've seen Mahomes be able to come up in big moments, and you really can't kill Steve Wilks or that defense for allowing those last couple drives. I mean, before the overtime touchdown, I believe the only touchdown that the Chiefs scored in that game was off of the muffed punt, which gave them possession at the 14-yard line. And, this is also considering the fact that they lost one of their best defenders, best players on the team, period, really, too, Dre Greenlaw, early in that game with just a freak injury. And, we talked about Oren Burks just wasn't really ready for that moment yet, necessarily just being thrown into it like he was. And obviously Mahomes is a smart enough quarterback that was able to take advantage of a backup linebacker, especially against a defensive group that was also very reliant on their linebackers to make plays to help relieve some of the pressure on their secondary. And it was just an unfortunate loss. Now, that's the Super Bowl itself, obviously the biggest of big games, and that's what we will look to first is, well, they're not the reason why they lost that Super Bowl. Why do you fire him? I agree. I want to make it clear, I don't think they should have fired Steve Wilks, but their defense wasn't great the first couple rounds. They were getting run all over. Between the Packers game and the Lions game, they allowed both of these teams to get off to hot starts and sort of forced Shanahan and this offense to climb their way back into these games. But again, I don't think you can fully put it on Steve Wilks here. And, Wilks is somebody that I think over the past couple seasons hasn't had it completely easy. I mean, he comes in as defensive coordinator for the 49ers here, which is, a big job, definitely high expectations. You saw the past two defensive coordinators that worked with the Niners went on to get head coaching jobs in Ryans and Saleh. But last year, part of the reason why he gets this defensive coordinator job is based off of the job that he did as the interim head coach for the Carolina Panthers last year after they fired... Which coach was it? Because Steichen was... No, it wasn't Steichen this year. That was the Colts. I don't know. Steve Wilks takes over as interim head coach for the Panthers last year and sort of helps to... Was that the Matt Rule year? I'm totally blanking on this right now. It could have been when Matt Rule was fired. The Panthers have had a lot of coaches as of late. So, Wilks takes over and sort of helps elevate that Panthers team down the stretch of the season, and ultimately enough to prove himself to be worthy of a defensive coordinator position. He leaves, and obviously roster a big issue there in Carolina, but the Panthers were terrible this year. And, I mean, they did still have a good defense as well, but, I just think that it's a little bit of, I'm not sure if it's making Wilks the scapegoat for this amongst all of the criticism for Shanahan at this moment. I mean, I'm curious where the decision really came from between Shanahan's the head coach. Did he want to move on from Wilks himself? He's obviously the one at the with the reporters delivering the news, but was this a John Lynch decision, their general manager? I don't know. I'm very interesting to see sort of, I mean, I don't know how many answers we really are going to get, at least on that front. And this obviously sort of ties in because we're talking about now after the Super Bowl, a lot of these teams have already hired some of the top candidates out there that they're not getting the first pick as far as a replacement for Steve Wilks. And here we are, coming off of a very successful season once again. It's not always just about the championship because only one team can win a ring. So I would consider this to be a successful year for the Niners. But now you're sort of gambling, making this risk late in the coaching cycle of trying to make a change at a position where I don't think you were necessarily short-handed. Now, obviously, the people in the room of the front office and within the coaching staff know way more than you or I possibly could about what's going on behind the scenes there. So it's a little unfair of us to, fully pin this as this is just McVay trying to blame somebody else for this loss, because I don't think that that's even an argument anybody could really make. Like, how could you say the defense lost the 49ers this Super Bowl? For as smart as Shanahan is, and we know that he's at least, somewhat football smart. He's very football smart, but I know he has a lot of critics now, but he, as a football mind, could not have watched that game back and been like, it is the defense's fault that we lost this game. Because I don't know, it's just it's a crazy concept to me. So again, I don't think that it was full scapegoat mode here, because I don't think that there's really an argument to be made. It's not throwing someone under the bus when there was no really cause for thinking that it possibly could have been on Steve Wilks, that game in particular. But I don't know. I mean, from what it sounds like, there were ups and downs with Wilks and that coaching staff throughout the season. Wilks started the year up in the coach's booth to call these games. Shanahan asked him to come down to the field for the latter half of the year. And again, it sounds like sort of the scheme fit was something that was a little bit of a concern to Shanahan, maybe to other coaches on the defensive staff, maybe to GM John Lynch. So again, whether or not we'll get answers to that, I'm not totally sure, but I am very curious to see who they come away with as their new defensive coordinator. I'm going to have to look into who the top options out there even still are, because I feel like this was a pretty heavy defensive, as far as coaching cycle goes. I feel like we saw a good amount of defensive coaches get promotions to head coach jobs more than sort of the recent trend of seeing a lot of offensive guys. There obviously were still offensive guys, but a lot of defensive guys that got opportunities. So we will see how this all sort of plays out, but we are going to be taking our second break. When we come back on the other side, we will be sticking with football. We're going to be talking about Justin Fields. Yesterday, I mentioned that was the biggest storyline in the coming off season. We're going to be diving a little bit more into that and talking about the potential landing spots for him. So stick with us.
For the best and latest podcasts available anywhere, go to the podcast app on your cell phone and type in GSMC to access free content-rich podcasts on health and wellness, book reviews, sports, entertainment, relationships, social media, movies, technology, finance, and even weird news. Subscribe and download the GSMC Podcast Network's family of shows, available everywhere podcasts are found.
Hello and welcome back to the GSMC Sports Podcast. Just finished up talking about Steve Wilks and the 49ers. Now we're going to be moving on to the Bears' decision with Justin Fields, and more so where from his perspective is the best place for him to end up. So we're going to be evaluating some of these landing spots for him. It's interesting because the way that this has all sort of been talked about as of the past couple weeks, a first-round pick is likely not in the cards for the Bears getting in return for Justin Fields, which I personally think makes sense if you talk about just sort of a little bit of the leverage. It's not that the Bears, that is, are necessarily handicapped in needing to go get a new quarterback, but if their intention clearly is to go get a new quarterback, they can't keep Justin Fields on the roster. So they would have to move on from him. And I think that, Fields is obviously a very interesting prospect as far as a quarterback to bring into your locker room to sort of help give you a fresh start and all of that. But it's not quite that simple as far as drafting him as if he were coming out of college. You have a decision to make on whether or not you are going to pay him the big money. And that sort of decreases the value a little bit because there is a chance that things don't work out. And I think that giving up a first round pick for one of these chances is just a little too much of a gamble, in my opinion. And I think that, Fields is a very good player. And, I haven't been the highest on him throughout his career, but I thought that last year he made real strides in the passing game. Still, the consistency with him is not perfect. And, I think it's figuring out that balance for him of how to use your legs to your advantage. But also, I think to a certain extent, you have to be able to make plays in the passing game as well. We've seen Lamar Jackson be able to develop this over the course of his NFL career, so I definitely don't think it's an impossibility that Justin Fields could do a similar thing himself. So, I think that a lot of teams should be interested in Justin Fields. There are a lot of teams that have concerns at the quarterback position, and considering it's probably not going to take a first-round pick unless things sort of change here, there are a bunch of teams that should be in on Fields, and I sort of wanted to go through the different options. Also, quickly before we do so, on the Bears side of this, I think it's sort of important to put things into perspective because no, you're maybe not getting a first round pick, but I don't think that should really make you hesitate on the decision of whether or not to move on from him. As a front office and as a coaching staff, I think that your top priority should be making sure the guy you are playing at quarterback can lead you eventually to a Super Bowl. In a perfect world, of course, not every team is a Super Bowl contender, but can you see this guy being a Super Bowl winning quarterback for you? And I know that not all situations are obviously built equal, but when you have the first overall pick, like the Bears do, you are hoping to cash out on the value that you have with that. And I think that for them, that means taking a quarterback, resetting their quarterback contract, and sort of starting over here. And you shouldn't get too hung up on the value of Fields because really it doesn't do much for you as a backup quarterback. And if you look in the past decade, there have been instances of teams moving off of quarterbacks quicker when need be. And I think that really the first one that I can really remember of this happening was the Cardinals deciding to draft Josh Rosen with the 10th pick in 2018. And then after a very rough rookie season, so he never showed anywhere near the promise of Justin Fields, but the Cardinals moved on from him 1 year later and drafted Kyler Murray when they had the number 1 overall pick. What's interesting is, again, Rosen was never looked to be really the ceiling guy of the caliber of Justin Fields. Rosen was more so seen as the ready now prospect coming into that draft, but they got a 2nd round pick and a 5th round pick in exchange for Rosen there. So a pretty decent return, and this is for a guy who hasn't made a start in the NFL since that following season in 2019, hasn't appeared in an NFL game period since 2021. So Fields is a far and away better quarterback than Rosen ever was, but the point is, you can just get value for that guy based off of the position that he plays. And if Fields isn't going to be a part of your future, there's no point in playing hardball or any of that. So, Kyler Murray, that is, has had his highs and lows with the Cardinals, but we knew that Josh Rosen wasn't the quarterback for the Cardinals. Nobody questions their decision to move on from him, especially because they got some value in return. Justin Fields, I'll say it one last time, obviously better than Rosen, but a lot of people are viewing it that it's just not going to work out between him and the Bears, so why prolong this any longer? On that note, moving into some of these landing spots for him, first off, the Pittsburgh Steelers have really been a team that has been getting a lot of buzz in the Justin Fields market as of late. Mike Tomlin has been a fan of him reportedly. It was Adam Schefter, I believe, of ESPN, who sort of started adding fuel to the fire with this one, talking about how much of a fan Tomlin is of Fields. And then he was on the Pat McAfee show within the past week, and he said, we know that Pittsburgh is going to go out and get some type of quarterback. Now, what exactly that means, not 100% sure. I mean, it could mean a couple different things. It could mean trying to go get a guy with a ceiling like Justin Fields. Or you could go with one of these more experienced guys that have been around the league for a bit, Russell Wilson, Ryan Tannehill. Or you could go even lower, keep Kenny Pickett, and also bring in one of these sort of middling guys that are the premier backups, Gardner Minshew, Jacoby Brissett, to sort of push Kenny Pickett a little bit in terms of his job security. Just throwing this out here, Joe Flacco, if he wanted to keep playing football for this season, I think that the Browns are going to have to move off of Flacco because of how much money they owe Deshaun Watson. Flacco wants a job. I mean, him going to the Steelers would be such an intriguing storyline. So just throwing it out there, probably not going to happen. But on the note of Fields to the Steelers, they have the 20th overall pick, which would probably be the ceiling of what the Bears could get in exchange for Fields. Not getting any sort of a high first-round pick. I don't think they're getting a first-round pick at all. But 20th is at least in the range of if there were any sort of a bidding war for Justin Fields, which we'll see as teams sort of decide how they want to go about finding their next quarterback. The 20th overall pick would sort of trump any other offer that another team could put out there. So, it's a little bit of an interesting decision. 20th is around the pick that they used to select Kenny Pickett with a first rounder in the 2022 draft. But, after building up a lot of excitement, I think, during training camps and preseason, he didn't deliver, Kenny Pickett that is, a spectacular season. And the Steelers' offense was a mess. There was the whole Matt Canada saga, everybody calling for his job, and him eventually being fired partway through the season. You had concerns with the lack of effort and the culture almost between George Pickens and Deontay Johnson, not playing hard, not blocking, not jumping on fumbles, all of that. And Pickett himself dealt with injuries because some less than ideal offensive line play. It was actually when he was out in the Texans game, which might have been his last game. I can't 100% remember, but I think it might have been the season-ending injury. Well, other than the fact that they actually chose to stick with Mason Rudolph down the stretch even when Pickett came back because they were winning with Rudolph, it was off of a play where their rookie tackle, Broderick Jones, got beat and Pickett sort of got rolled up on. So, this is the team, like I mentioned, not my favorite landing spot necessarily. They have some receiver talent. I like their running backs. Najee, good, solid player. I really like Jaylen Warren. I think that he is a great running back. And, overall, the two of those combinations plus the receivers, again, not my favorite spot. Steelers are in a weird position right now. Like, they win regular season games. Tomlin still has a streak of no losing seasons going on, but hasn't won a playoff game since 2016 despite being somewhat in the position. And quarterback has been a little bit of the struggles there as of these last few years. Roethlisberger on his final legs took them to the playoffs and maybe one of the worst playoff teams we have seen in the past decade or so. But the Steelers could definitely be looking to make a push, and I think that Justin Fields would be an interesting option to at least kick the tires on. The next team I have is the Seattle Seahawks. I yesterday talked about Seattle's decision that is coming up with Geno Smith. We still haven't heard back about that yet, but to quickly sort of summarize that, the Seahawks have an option of whether or not to release Geno Smith by Friday. They save themselves something $12-13 million if they do so by Friday. If not, that money is guaranteed for next year. They can still get out, but it's not quite as easy. So there's speculation. Among that speculation, Mike McDonald hinted to the media about his hopes for Ryan Grubb, their new offensive coordinator, developing a stronger run game, and Geno could be a part of that, but sort of also insinuates that they're not quite looking to be quite as pass heavy in the upcoming season. McDonald, when it comes to run game, McDonald has spent the better part of the last decade with the Ravens, who of course have Lamar Jackson and is the prototypical running quarterback and knows how to incorporate those running aspects from the quarterback position in the run game as a whole. So, I don't know, maybe a little bit of a parallel there. McDonald was hired to a 6-year contract, which means he has the flexibility to sort of help rebuild this thing, which you can interpret a couple different ways, whether or not they want to don't want to rush into this thing, or they probably have a little bit of flexibility to go and gamble on somebody in year one, but that would also include potentially having to pay him big money going forward. So a little bit interesting, not totally sure, but they have the receivers to, surround Justin Fields or whoever's at quarterback with. Lockett, Metcalf, and their rookie from last year, Jackson Smith and Jigba, are all under contract next season. The offensive line's a little bit of a mess, and they also don't have a second-round pick to trade for Fields. Second round, one of those day 2 picks, I think second round is probably about the price that the Bears are going to primarily get for Fields. They don't have that because they just traded that for Leonard Williams this past year, but I think Fields would look really cool in a Seahawks jersey, especially those vintage ones, and I think it would be a pretty decent fit. Last team here I have, for today at least, is the Atlanta Falcons. I think this is my favorite destination for Fields. Atlanta has been really held back by their quarterback play the past couple seasons. I think that last year was just a disaster at that quarterback position. It started heading into the year where Arthur Blank talked during the offseason that he had no interest in Lamar Jackson, and whether or not they actually would have been able to get him is one thing, but to not even entertain the idea or force the Ravens' hand is crazy. said that he thought that they had enough in Desmond Ritter and Taylor Heineke. So really not great there. Now Arthur Smith is out as the head coach there. They bring in Raheem Morris as their new head coach. I love the hire. He is defensive minded, but I think that he's a really good culture setter, and he's at least been around Sean McVay for the past couple seasons. That, not saying he would dictate the offense by any means, but maybe he's at least, aware of some of these strategies to build up a good offense. I think that Justin Fields could definitely slide into a similar sort of role there that could benefit in a Shanahan McVay offense. I know it's a lot of quick passes, but to sort of take that with the weapons that they have in Bijan, Tyler Algier, Drake London, Kyle Pitts, Jonnu Smith, and sort of operate this quick fire offense where there's a running threat. You have two very good running backs in the backfield. They're probably a wide receiver short, but they are building something here. And they have the number 8 pick in the draft, where there is a little bit of rumors floating around there that the Falcons really like J.J. McCarthy, the Michigan quarterback, which could spoil this idea. I'm not the biggest J.J. McCarthy guy myself, and I would rather see Fields there in Atlanta and use that number 8 pick on one of these elite receivers that are coming out in the draft this season. But I guess we'll just have to continue to see as this moves on. There are, of course, other teams that could potentially take a stab at Justin Fields. I don't think that the Broncos have the money, but they're going to be needing a quarterback likely. Patriots, Raiders. So there are definitely moves to be made for Fields. I expect that he's going to have a market, and I am curious to see how much competition there's going to be in the pursuit of Fields. That is all we have on that for now. We're going to be taking our final break, and when we come back on the other side, we will be talking some NBA and the games that took place last night, so stick with us. Welcome back to the GSMC Sports Podcast, brought to you by the GSMC Sports Network. Headed into our final segment here, we are going to be talking some NBA. We are just on the brink of the All-Star break. So tonight is actually the final games before the break. There were 13 last night, so we're just going to sort of bounce around here with those last set of games before, again, a few more tonight, but as we sort of start to gear towards the All-Star break and getting into a lot of these conversations about where we are at this break point in terms of standings, in terms of rookies, in terms of contenders, all those different conversations we will be having over the next week. But starting with last night, the big game, in my opinion, was the Clippers versus the Warriors, where it went down to the final minute, and this was a very interesting game because the Warriors came in to this game on a winning streak. They were sort of, maybe not rounding a corner, but they were figuring themselves out more. They had been really firing on offense, especially since Draymond Green has returned from his suspension, and they just looked like a lot better version of themselves. And last night, unfortunately, I mean, there was a little bit of something brewing. They were very much carried by their young guys in Brandon Pajemski and Jonathan Kuminga in the first half, which isn't all too concerning because that's, part of what they've been doing this year. They need these young guys to bring that energy. And I mean, the smarts too. Like, Kuminga is more of the raw talent, and you can see sort of the step-by-step progression with him over time of correcting his mistakes, but he's still a little bit erratic and in a fun way. I've talked about him before where I think that it's so interesting the way that he was thrown into this Warriors team because he was a little bit more of a project player, but the ceiling was so clearly there, led to maybe him not getting a ton of minutes, not as many as he would have liked to his first couple years. He was frustrated with Steve Kerr earlier this season about his lack of usage, and they sort of talked him into this new role, and he has been tremendous there. And again, mistakes still do happen with him, but at a much lower rate, and we see a lot more of the greatness coming from him instead. So, he only finishes last night with 13 points, but I think he had 10 at halftime. And the other one, Brandon Pajemski, he's been incredible. I mean, he is a smart player. He hit some big shots for them down the stretch as well. He leads the NBA in charges drawn. I mean, he is just a high IQ player that really seems to fit into this Warriors style of play. Now, obviously, then come the third quarter where Steph Curry erupts. He scores, it was at least 13 points when he had reached the NBA record fourth consecutive game with 7 or more three-pointers that has never been done before in NBA history. He finishes with 41, but it was the fourth quarter where this Warriors team collapsed, as we've seen them do many times this year. Now, keep in mind, the Clippers are running this game without Kawhi Leonard, and Paul George had a pretty quiet first half, but he started to get himself going in the third quarter after a, again, slow start where James Harden was sort of initiating most of the offense for them. But the Warriors were up by 11 going into that fourth quarter. They let the Clippers back into the game, but even then, they have a lead with about 4 minutes left, and just the defensive lapses started to burn them. They were sending a lot of double teams at Paul George throughout the game, knowing that, there's no Kawhi Leonard to hurt you. Russell Westbrook got a lot of minutes, and it was very interesting to see the way that teams have been playing him lately, but pretty much doubling off of him and, sending two at the ball handlers, leaving Russell Westbrook open in the corner. Westbrook adjusted to that in the fourth quarter by taking advantage of that, cutting the backdoor a bunch, especially on, it was the Harden and Zubac double team, or pick and rolls, I should say. Westbrook was getting backdoor. He got a couple layups. He grabbed a few offensive rebounds that were big for them. And, I mean, it's just good to see Westbrook, contribute any way that he can. He's not typically going to be a closing minutes guy, I don't think, for this Clippers team. And it's interesting because the Clippers like to play a lot of this small ball. It's sort of been one of their things for the past few years. And Westbrook eliminates a little bit of the benefits of it because the idea is you want to be able to space out the other team and run. Russell Westbrook can run. He cannot really space out other defenses. So that's what was going on in this Warriors game, but he ends up making plays down the stretch. And it wasn't just him because, again, how I got into this is the fact that they were sending a lot of doubles at Paul George, at Harden, running the pick and roll with Zubac, and as a result, they were leaving guys open in the corner. Norman Powell in particular, he had 12 in the fourth, and he was just knocking down threes from both corners. There was one really bad just lapse on the part of Curry to, it's not that he was doubling, he just got caught ball watching a little bit. And when the pass swings over to Powell, he doesn't step up enough. He gives him too much room, and that sort of ignited his run where he hit, it was maybe 3 straight possessions with 3-pointers. He hit 2 in the left, he hits 1 in the right, and then it was Amir Coffey hitting that last 3 in the right corner as well that really put them out of contention for this one. It was Coffey, yeah. Off of a very impressive Westbrook drive, I might add, where he had the amount of distance he covered on his Euro step before kicking out to the corner for Coffey was pretty wild. And Coffey hits that shot. Coffey also grabs an offensive rebound that really sealed the game. There was a very interesting moment with Klay Thompson. Obviously, a big subplot of this Warriors team this season has been Klay Thompson sort of coming into his understanding of what kind of role he needs to hold going forward for this Warriors team, because he's clearly not the same version of himself. He was on the bench for a good stretch of those last few minutes. He ends up getting subbed in with 48 seconds left, and after a very clutch Brandon Pajemski 3 to cut the lead to 3 points with about 50 or so seconds left, Klay intentionally fouls immediately. Westbrook goes to the line, goes 2 for 2, and again, it was the Coffey rebound that ultimately ended the game for them, but a really rough mental lapse there for Klay, who he's been in the moment so many times. I feel like he's just mentally a little bit disrupted based off of, coming to terms with not always going to be on the floor in the closing minutes. I got to be on my A game, and putting a lot of pressure mentally on himself in those moments. And I think that it just sort of led to a lapse with him last night, and definitely not the reason why they lost. I mean, he was cold for the floor from a lot of the game. He started heating up a little bit late in the third, early in the fourth, but again, a pretty unspectacular game for him. And, it's just something that continuing to watch here, and it's a little bit sad, it's everybody has to deal with their own mortality in some ways. And I know that it's just a game and a sport to a lot of people, but this has been Klay's livelihood for his entire life, and there is an adjustment that needs to be done. And I think that, he is working his way into it, but, that takes time. And I've talked about this Warriors team in the past. I just don't think they have what it takes really to make that championship push. So I guess we'll leave it with that with the Warriors. Big game for the Clippers to come back and pull this out, especially without Kawhi. And again, I think that the different types of layups and everything, or lineups, I should say, are a very interesting sort of subplot for me going forward watching this team. We know how good their offense can be. I mean, last night, what did they end up scoring? 130, I think it was. And this is, again, without their best offensive player, really. I know that Harden is the initiator for them, but the efficiency that Kawhi's been playing with this year, and you look at, they double Paul George tonight, or last night, I should say, because there's no Kawhi, and Kawhi is the one who really gets those double team looks. I'd have to look up the, percentage of possessions that he gets doubled on, but it's a lot. This is a big win for them to have. So I guess that's my thoughts there on that game. The other one that really stuck out to me was the Kings versus the Nuggets. I've been very, very intrigued with the Western Conference this year. I think that it's just so deep, and it's so interesting to see sort of how this all plays out. But the Kings came off of a bad loss the other night that sort of hurt them a little bit. And they come and they play the Nuggets. The other night was the loss to the Suns, where they sort of gave that one away late. But coming into this Nuggets game, there's no Jamal Murray on the other side. So very limited lineups on the Nuggets side. You had guys like Colin Gillespie and Peyton Watson playing a lot of fourth quarter minutes for them, which is, Peyton Watson's been getting a lot of minutes this year, period, but not necessarily. I felt like Gillespie, especially down the stretch in those big moments, didn't really know where to go off ball himself, but really it was De'Aaron Fox just taking over down the stretch. He went on a personal 6-0 run at one point, and the defensive awareness and IQ wasn't really there for Denver, and Fox was just taking advantage in that pick and roll game. He was playing well on defense. We saw him the other night too. I mean, he just works so hard. He had that poke against Durant late in the game on Tuesday where he just came from behind, poked it out, led to the transition bucket for them late in that game. He stripped it from Reggie Jackson in this game, got himself an easy transition dunk, and he just took over down the stretch for this Kings team that I don't have probably a ton of faith in when it comes to the playoffs, but I just feel like I have so much fun watching Domantas Sabonis and De'Aaron Fox play basketball. I mean, they are so good. I'll say it again. I think it's crazy that neither one of them are an all-star based off of the types of seasons that they're having, but you get Sabonis with another triple-double in this game. I think it was either this game or the Phoenix game he had it in the third quarter. I mean, he is just ridiculous. And, for the Nuggets, I don't really worry about too much of any of their individual games, game by game. I know they were blown out by the Bucks the other night. They lose tonight to the Kings here. I think it's more so you just have to have faith in the infrastructure of that team and that they are going to come out in the big moments. Again, no Jamal Murray even for this game, but they are definitely a little bit dealing with depth issues, and that's why they're playing the Gillespies, the Watsons. Holiday was in for them as well. One of the Holiday brothers. Was it Justin Holiday? I always forget because Justin, the Holiday that is on the Rockets lately has actually been incredible knocking down big shots, and Justin Holiday is the one on the Nuggets, which means Aaron Holiday, I think, is the one that plays for the Rockets, and the Rockets end up losing that game last night as well to the Grizzlies, who I love watching the Grizzlies. I really do. Unironically, I know they're not good, but this team fights so hard, and I'm a very big Vince Williams fan, actually. That has sort of been a development for myself over the course of this season, but the way that they just sort of deal with all the adversity, all the injuries that they've dealt with, and they got some young players that have really been stepping up for them. Again, Vince Williams, I mentioned, who I think started the year on a 2-way contract. GG Jackson was spectacular for them last night. So we are just about out of time here, but I do want to quickly give a shout out to Deni Avdija. The Wizards are the worst team in the NBA and the worst future, in my opinion. I think that they really struggle with any cornerstones. Now, honestly, a little bit of encouraging Kyle Kuzma quotes over the past couple days in terms of wanting to stay there, not worrying about getting his individual points, but trying to do the other stuff. I like Kuzma as a player too, but as far as, young pieces to build around, I didn't really think they had a real guy there, but Deni Avdija explodes for a career high 41, I think it was last night, and I've been really impressed with him this season as a whole. It was 43, actually. His previous high was 25, and Zion, after the game, because they played the Pelicans in this one, gave Avdija props for not just the scoring, but his two-way ability, and I think that is sort of what stuck out to me. He's been a very good defender for the past few years. He's out of Israel. He was a lottery pick a few years ago, and the offense wasn't really there, but there was always that effort and defensive presence, and he was really, really impressive in this game. He was very much exhausted by the end of it, again, because he's a two-way guy, and he was pretty much the sole reason, maybe I shouldn't say sole, but the Wizards were down by 20 points, and they ended up making it at least a game in the fourth quarter. They come short. Avdia can't fully get his legs under him to finish the job. But if you're a Wizards fan, you don't have all that much to be excited about. I would genuinely be excited about Deni Avdia. I think he's becoming a really good player for a team that has been incredibly disappointing over the past few seasons. So that is all I have for today. Thank you very much for tuning in. Thank you to the GSMC Sports Network for allowing us to host this show. We will be back tomorrow, same time, 2 o'clock. So thank you all for tuning in. And just a reminder to like and follow. See you tomorrow.
Let's go. I wake up to a little bit of drool on my pillow, feel like it's gonna be a bad day. Yeah, I'm tired of shit, and the coffee ain't hit yet, damn it.